Hey guys, welcome to How to Nominate a Place in Peril. We are going to wait just a few minutes to make sure that everybody can get on before we go ahead and start with the webinar today. We trust that everyone can hear us okay, but if you are having any issues hearing, well, I guess you can't even let us know, can you? Because you can't hear us. Okay, so it's 3:04 now. We'll give it one more minute before we go ahead and get started.
All right. Hey, Mark, I think we've got a critical mass, so I think we're ready to go.
Terrific. Well, this is Mark MacDonald speaking to you all. I'm the president of the Georgia Trust, and welcome to this webinar. We're very grateful for all of your involvement in historic preservation and your interest in the Places in Peril program. And we really are also appreciative of your patience as we experiment with these new web-based technologies. It's really our preference at the Trust to get together in person, either at Rhodes Hall in Atlanta or at Hay House in Macon, or even in your community. So we do look forward to the day that we can all get back together in person. Today we're going to be talking about the Places in Peril program, which has been one of the Georgia Trust landmark programs. We've done it for over 15 years. This will be our 16th year of Places in Peril. And I've just got a few statistics for you that really show the effectiveness of the program. We've had, as I said, 15 years. We usually do 10 sites a year. So there have been approximately 150 sites listed on Places in Peril in those 15 years. A remarkable 93% of the listings are still in existence today. Majority of Places in Peril sites have made significant progress, with over 30 sites being completely restored. At least 7 of the Places in Peril sites have now been restored to such an excellence that they've received Georgia Trust Preservation Awards. Unfortunately, 10 have been demolished. So we've really lost less than 7% of the sites listed on Places in Peril, which is, I think, a good sign of the program's success. And I don't think the Trust takes credit for the success of these sites, because it's true, and we say this time and time again, it's because of local efforts at preservation with the assistance of the Georgia Trust in the program that they're successful. So the program actually does work. We want to, as we go through today and talk about how to prepare a nomination, I want y'all to be thinking if this is really the optimal time to nominate your site. This first year, when they're listed, is really a banner year in terms of the publicity that you're going to get for your site, in terms of the attention that our Georgia Trust staff is going to give you. And it's really important that you be ready when the program is kicked off in the fall of 2020. So it may be beneficial for you to wait a year. So I really hope that y'all will take that into consideration, because it's really and truly the local support for the site, whether your local community is ready to do the fundraising, if it's a fundraising problem, whether it's public relations within the community. It's just so important that it all be primed and ready to go when we drop the list in November of the year. So again, I would just want to thank you all for your participation. It's now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker today, and that's Dennis Lavelle. You can see his picture there. He is our Historic Properties Coordinator with the Georgia Trust. So Dennis, I'm going to now turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark, and good afternoon, everyone. We here at the Georgia Trust really appreciate everyone turning out for our first webinar, and it's an honor and uncharted waters for us, but we're together, we'll sail these waters and hopefully get a lot of information to you guys about Places in Peril. And first, let's start off with our agenda for this afternoon. First, we're going to have an introduction to the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation. Then we're going to have that followed up by an explanation of the Places in Peril program. And then we'll highlight some past Places in Peril sites. And then we're going to tell you how to make that nomination. And that'll be followed by question and answer. Speaking of question and answer, I want you guys to be aware that there is a handout attachment that you'll be able to download after the webinar. And also, anytime during the webinar, please submit your questions and we will answer as many of them as possible at the end of the webinar. So with that housekeeping out of the way, why don't we talk about who we are at the Georgia Trust. And we were founded in 1973 The Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation works for the preservation and revitalization of Georgia's diverse historic resources and advocates their appreciation, protection, and use. We are the statewide nonprofit preservation organization. We are one of the country's largest statewide nonprofit preservation organizations with more than 4,000 members. And how we advocate while providing support and resources, we have four bullet points here. The first is that we generate community revitalization by finding buyers for endangered properties acquired by our revolving fund. We raise awareness of other endangered historic resources through an annual listing of Georgia's places in peril. We recognize preservation projects and individuals with our annual preservation awards and we award students and professionals with the Neil Reed Prize and Liz Lyon Fellowship. We offer a variety of educational programs, provide technical assistance to property owners and historic communities, advocate for funding, tax incentives, and other laws aiding preservation efforts. And we also manage 2 historic properties. You may know our properties here in Atlanta at Rhodes Hall and down in Macon, the Hay House. So let's talk about Places in Peril and what is it? It was launched in 2006 and the program annually identifies 10 historic sites threatened by demolition, neglect, lack of maintenance, inappropriate development, or insensitive public policy. The list also raises awareness about Georgia's significant historic, archaeological, and cultural resources, including buildings, structures, districts, archaeological sites, and cultural landscapes. Our Places in Peril criteria are as follows. Historic significance. Sites must be listed in or eligible for the National Register of Historic Places or the Georgia Register of Historic Places. A threat. A site must be subject to a serious threat to its existence or historical, architectural, and/or archaeological integrity. Community commitment. Sites must be those that the sponsoring entity believes have community support and identified potential partners. Outcomes. Sites must have the potential to be helped by this campaign and a reasonable potential for an ultimately successful outcome. Messages. Sites must be able to illustrate through their listing positive messages about preservation and highlight universal threats endangering historic properties in the state. And finally, diversity. Geographical distribution and the variety of property building types and issues constituencies served must be considered in the overall selection of sites. Now let's talk about the role of the Georgia Trust. The Trust encourages owners and individuals, organizations, and communities to employ preservation tools, partnerships, and resources necessary to preserve and utilize selected historic properties in peril. Another role of the Georgia Trust is what we like to call the Media Blitz. And the Media Blitz really kicks off with our Rambler. So each property here is featured in the Rambler, the Trust quarterly newsletter. This publication, you guys, reaches our 4,000 plus members by mail and is handed out at Trust events and gatherings. We also conduct an online Media Blitz. The property is listed in the Trust Weekly e-blast, headlines and happenings. It's also posted to the Trust Facebook page, posted to the Trust Instagram feed, and then the combined post of all 3 online platforms nets an estimated total audience of over 30,000 followers. And finally, we have the traditional Media Blitz. Main source of publicity for Places in Peril comes from a statewide network of media made up of local and regional outlets. And this casts a wide net, reaching hundreds of thousands of people, not only through print, but through television and online. Also, our role at the Georgia Trust is to give each site personal attention. And this entails that each site receives personalized attention from a Georgia Trust staff member. This individual will act as a liaison, and we help the site and those involved with general support. Some of the examples of that support include providing preservation resources, helping research grants, and handling general media outreach. And now I'd like to throw it over to Ben Sutton, our Director of Preservation, who will highlight past Places in Peril sites. Go ahead, Ben.
Thank you, Dennis. As we mentioned earlier, in the 15 years of the Places in Peril program, we have seen a tremendous number of successes, with a vast majority having found some level of reprieve or stabilization, and nearly 20% of Places in Peril sites being fully restored. We are proud of the diversity of resources that have been highlighted through the years, whether it's a vernacular Gothic church, such as the Antioch Baptist Church in rural Taliaferro County, or a modernist masterpiece in downtown Atlanta with the Central Atlanta Library designed by Marcel Brauer. Unique structures, such as the Chattahoochee Park Pavilion, which is the last remaining structure of an early 20th century amusement park for Georgia Power employees outside of Gainesville, and the industrial mining landscape of Dobbins Mine, one of the country's first manganese mines located in Bartow County, which was threatened by planned GDOT construction. From its earliest iterations, the Places in Peril program has served as a catalyst for successful preservation. One of the original 10 sites in 2006, the cultural site of St. Eome's Passaquan, has undergone a complete restoration and is now owned and maintained by Columbus State University. Fort Daniel in Gwinnett County was the site of a late 18th century fort on Georgia's frontier, dividing territories between Cherokee and Creek Indians and white settlers. Encroaching suburban development threatened the site, but sustained advocacy saved the site, which is now operated as an archaeological research park that's available to school children and the public. In Savannah, the Berrien House, an early federal style house for Georgia, dates to 1790, is perhaps one of the best examples of persistence as preservation. For nearly 20 years, the local preservation organization in Savannah fought to ensure the house was not demolished. Following a listing in Places in Peril, along with continued advocacy at the local level, a descendant of the Berrien family was able to purchase the house and undertook a full restoration, which was completed in the last 2 years. At times, the peril is immediately obvious and catastrophic. The Hancock County Courthouse is one of the few sites to be listed twice, first in 2013 for general neglect and lack of maintenance, and then again in 2015 following a devastating fire. And yet, thanks to the county commissioners who had the courage to push for a rebuilding and the foresight to have a sufficient insurance policy in place, the courthouse was reconstructed in 2 years' time. In Augusta, the C.T. Walker House is a very good example of a preservation win that may not be as evident, but is no less hard won. C.T. Walker, a prominent African-American minister who, after being born into slavery, became the founder of one of the largest churches in America, lived in this house in the early 20th century. The local preservation organization, Historic Augusta, was able to purchase the home and stabilize it while working with community partners to have the significance of the site recognized. Unfortunately, not every outcome has been as encouraging. As Mark alluded to, these sites are in peril and we have lost some. The Dart House in Brunswick, over 140 years old, was demolished by its owner, the Chamber of Commerce, despite efforts to find another steward for the property. In 2015, perhaps our most notable loss, Glenridge Hall in Sandy Springs was demolished after the private property was sold for subdivision development. And most recently, the gardens at the Juliette Gordon Low birthplace in Savannah, originally designed by Georgia's first female landscape architect, Claremont Lee, was approved for demolition and alterations to the site. A loss of a cultural landscape. On occasion, listing in places in peril brings immediate and unexpected results. In 2016, after listing, Lyon Farm, one of the few remaining early farmsteads in DeKalb County, received a commitment of $200,000 from the county watershed management, which owns the property, and funded a full exterior stabilization project. That same year, the Claflin School, an African-American high school in Columbus, was identified by an out-of-state developer after seeing the Places in Peril list as an ideal project for a housing development that utilized state and federal rehabilitation tax credits. The project has just completed this spring. But as we've seen, most of the success found through Places in Peril program are thanks to the long-term commitment of our local partners and the communities in which these sites exist. A wonderful example is from the Places in Peril 2010, Capricorn Studios in Macon. For nearly a decade, local advocates worked for the preservation, including Newtown Macon, Historic Macon, and finally Mercer University, who has purchased the building and completed a full restoration into museum and studio and rental practice space for their student musicians. And I just want to point out that just because you are listed in 1 year, that does not mean that you get the trust's attention for 1 year. Once a site is a place in peril, we are frequently involved as things change or opportunities arise. And a wonderful example of that is the Zion Episcopal Church down in Talbotton. Originally listed in 2011, just in the last year, the Georgia Trust was able to work with the diocese to relinquish the property from church ownership, protect it with a conservation easement, and then transfer ownership to a local nonprofit organization that is dedicated to the preservation of the structure. Following that involvement with the Georgia Trust, the organization was able to raise nearly $200,000 and is in the process of completing a full exterior restoration. So again, it may not happen overnight, but we find frequently that with persistence and strong local partnership, we can come up with some really spectacular results. Perhaps no project exemplifies the sustained commitment of a local community combined with the benefits of Places in Peril listing better than the Fairview School in Cave Spring. As you can see from the photographs, it was certainly in peril. In fact, some of the folks interested in the site did not even know that the building was there. They thought that there were no extant buildings any longer on the site, and they were able to uncover this one underneath the kudzu. The first grade building was part of a campus for African American students that included a Rosenwald school. Despite its condition, a group of citizens and alumni pushed to preserve it and nominated the building for Places in Peril, getting it listed in the National Register of Historic Places as well, and hosting numerous volunteer work days. After working diligently behind the scenes, they also worked on the front end of the project, raising funds through grants, both from the state of Georgia as well as private entities, private donors, and hosting not an insignificant number of community dinners and spaghetti dinners and small fundraising events as well. After 10 years, the building is ready to serve the community again as a museum and field trip site. And I'm happy to say that this project received a 2020 Preservation Award from the Georgia Trust. So this is one of those that has been saved to a point where we have recognized it as an exemplary preservation project. So I hope this provides a better understanding of what your site could attain with the help of the Georgia Trust's Places in Peril program. And perhaps we've encouraged you to look towards the outcomes that you would like to see for your community. Now I'll turn it over to Danielle, who will walk through the steps of creating a strong nomination.
Thanks, Ben. So my name is Danielle Meunier, and I am the Preservation Communications Coordinator. So with all of the overview that both Mark, Dennis, and Ben have provided, now we can look at how you actually would make a nomination for the Places in Peril program. So we do have a nomination form, and this can be found on our website, which is georgiatrust.org. And you'd have to kind of go through some of the tabs on our website, but if you go to our programs, you can see all of the programs that we offer and select Places in Peril, and you'll see all of the information about our Places in Peril program. You'll see examples of past Places in Peril, like Ben has highlighted, and you will see a link to download this year's nomination form. The nominations are currently being accepted for the 2021 list. And the deadline for these nominations will be June 19th, and I'll touch on that a little bit more. But once you download this nomination form, just to walk you through very quickly, there is a cover page, and that highlights just some of the requirements and instructions for filling out the nomination. And then the first page of the application looks like this, which you see on your screen. And it asks for just some basic information about the site. Things like the location, age, the type of ownership, whether it's public or private, and also, as you might be able to see there, the historic designation. So that may include anything from National Register designation to statewide Georgia Register designation or local. And it was pointed out earlier by Dennis that it is a criteria or criterion of our program that it be designated. We can talk a little bit more about that as I go forward. But then the other sections are just asking for information about you as the nominator and information about the owner. So that should be pretty straightforward and easy. And then the remaining pages of the application form are in a narrative question format. And so we'll walk through what those questions are and the kind of information that we are looking for. The first question asks to provide a brief history of the property and why it is significant. So here, of course, you want to include information about the age of the site, how historic it may be, if there's any sort of notable architect or builder, and really what makes this property significant. Why is it worth saving, right? So this could be anything from, the type of architecture, maybe the function of the building in the community and the purpose that it has served historically. It may be that it's affiliated with a specific person or event that's notable. And also think here about how the site is relevant to the community today. So that's the kind of information you want to highlight there. There's a full page here to provide your answer for the history of the property, and we allow up to 2 additional pages to be included. And while there is a lot of space, you can include a lot of information, we do ask you to try and be as direct and concise as possible. You want to communicate why this property should be saved. The second question is asking to describe the nature of the threat to the property. So, what is the threat that this particular property may be facing? Is it demolition, neglect or lack of maintenance, inappropriate development? So that may be, maybe a new development is going to be built around the site or near the site that may have an adverse effect or impact on it. Or maybe something like the subdivision of that property where the site is located that could impact it. Insensitive public policy could be the nature of the threat, meaning that there are maybe no local protections in place to save the building and if it's threatened, or a policy that encourages poor use of the site or encourages, kind of as I mentioned, new development maybe. And then the final piece here is how imminent is the threat? Is there a schedule for demolition already or a potential insensitive development? And how soon might that be? And then the third question covers past efforts to save the property. So please identify any entities, organizations, and/or individuals that have a goal to save the property and describe how they would be willing to work towards the preservation of the property. Here, we're really trying to understand the level of support and how past efforts may dictate the success of a current listing on Places in Peril and help us gauge that in our selection. The fourth question covers the goals. What would you hope to accomplish if your project is placed on the Places in Peril list? So how can bringing more awareness spur some sort of action at your site? What are you hoping to achieve? So whether that's maybe trying to prevent demolition by gaining more community support or putting pressure on local authorities. Maybe it's bringing awareness to help with fundraising or to help stabilize and rehabilitate the site. It could be identifying potential partners, buyers, or developers of the site. In the past, I will just say our list has caught the attention of developers who are willing to step in and purchase and then rehabilitate or adaptively reuse a property. And that's particularly helpful with larger sort of white elephant type sites, mills, things like that, where it's very difficult to find a developer or someone to take a project on in your local community. Maybe the goal is to get insight and guidance from this trust on contractors and professionals who can assist you with saving the site. And maybe the owner is the problem, the person who might not be maintaining or trying to demolish the property. So something like putting pressure on them or trying to connect them with resources so that they have different options for how they can, what they can do with their site. Those are the kinds of things you want to be thinking about when we talk about goals. And then finally, the fifth narrative question asks if there's any potential opposition to including the site on the list. So I'll just say that opposition is not necessarily a problem. It won't prevent us from listing it, but we do want to evaluate the level of support and where there may be potential roadblocks. Sometimes the owner may not be supportive. As I said, that won't necessarily prevent us from listing it if the owner is the source of the threat. But because that person directly controls what happens to the site, it is helpful for us to evaluate how much success we might have if that's the opposition. It could also be opposition or just lack of support from local authorities or things like that. And if there is general opposition from the larger community, that's definitely something that we just want to know about, because this all factors into the potential outcome or success of that site. So what we're looking for in a nomination. This really is just kind of going back to the criteria that Dennis touched on earlier. These are the primary things that you want to point out when you're filling out your nomination and thinking about how you answer some of these questions. So the historic significance, as I mentioned, sites have to be listed on or eligible for the National Register or Georgia Register of Historic Places. So when I talk about eligibility, if the site is not officially listed on either of those lists, then it could still be eligible. If something is significant for being associated with a very important person, place, event, type of architecture, it's very likely that it could be eligible for listing, which means we would still consider it. But if you have questions about listing, I would go ahead and direct those to us, and we have provided our contact information in this webinar. So you will have that information, and you can certainly reach out to us and we can help you identify whether the site may be eligible if it's not currently listed. And then also under historic significance, you just want to be trying to demonstrate that level of value of what makes it significant, because that's something that we'll be weighing in our decision. The threat, so sites must be subject to a serious threat to their existence or historical, architectural, or archaeological integrity. And the level and how imminent that threat is, again, is another thing that weighs into our decision. Community commitment, we want to make sure that sites that become the sponsoring entity believe that they have community support and have identified potential partners. We want the site to have a successful outcome. So, much of that depends on sort of the feet on the ground, as we are a statewide organization. It'll be the local representatives representing that site that really have the greatest impact. And so the stronger that community commitment, the better the outcome, which of course outcomes is our next criterion. We are looking for sites that have the potential to be helped by this campaign and a reasonable potential for an ultimately successful outcome. With messaging, we're looking for sites that illustrate through their listing positive messages about preservation and that can highlight universal threats that are endangering historic properties in the state. So a site maybe that's representative of a broader issue or type of threat, or maybe even type of building that's suffering similar threats. In past years, we've seen certainly a lot of nominations for churches, historic churches, and school buildings. And so those very often make it on our list, but we try to choose buildings that represent a bigger issue. And then finally, diversity. So we're not only looking for a variety of property or building types, but also a variety of threats and issues, as well as a variety of constituencies that are served. And finally, just for our own internal review of the overall list of sites, we do try and choose sites that are geographically distributed. So I think Mark mentioned in the very beginning, if a site isn't selected maybe in one year, it does not mean that it's not eligible to be selected for a list in a future year. And then finally, after you have completed the nomination form, we do also ask you to submit photographs, a minimum of 10 or maximum of 15 digital images. I can go through the very sort of specifics here, but this is also included on the nomination form, so you'll have that information. We do require high-res or high-resolution images, and we ask that they are not submitted in like a Word document or a PDF file. We do want the individual images. And these are really meant to give our Places in Peril committee, because we do have a committee, an accurate impression of the property. So, well-lit subjects, if possible, and a range of views that clearly depict the condition or reasons why the site is in peril are most helpful, and that's what we'll be looking for. Historic images are also encouraged if available. And larger photo files can be shared electronically through file sharing platforms like Dropbox, Google Drive, or just a zip drive. Mailed applications are also accepted, and if you mail in your application, then we do ask that you include any of the photographs on a disk or a flash drive. And then finally, to submit your nomination, as I just said, you can email it or you can mail it. Email nominations are preferable. And you can email that to preservation@georgiatrust.org. You can also, of course, direct any questions there. And if you mail it in, that is our mailing address here in Atlanta. Again, all of that information is included on the form, so you will have that. And then just looking at the timeline for this program. So as I mentioned, we currently have nominations open. We're accepting nominations. And Friday, June 19th, so a little over a month from now, is the deadline to get those nominations in. And after that, our committee will meet to review over multiple meetings during the summer. And they will make their final selections, their final 10, by the end of the summer into the early fall. Once that list and final selection is determined, we will be notifying nominees, or we will be notifying nominators, whether they've been selected or not, approximately 1 month before our public announcement. So that would be around early October. And then once we've notified folks who are on the list, which sites have been selected, we do actually send a volunteer photographer out who drives around the entire state and photographs our current Places in Peril sites. And then after all of that, we work very diligently to compile a lot of information so that in November 2020, we can make the public announcement. And so, of course, we'd be announcing the 2021 list. And that announcement is essentially the Trust will do a media campaign. We send out press releases across the state, as well as targeted media to the locations of the sites. And we have a lot of success with this. Sometimes it's even picked up by national news. But there's a huge amount of awareness and publicity that is garnered through this initiative. And it's really one of the big benefits of the program. And then finally, we host an announcement reception on the same day, and that takes place at Rhodes Hall, which is our headquarters here in Atlanta. And all are welcome to attend. So certainly site representatives, but it's open to the public, anyone who wants to come. And prior to that reception, we do actually have a little kickoff meeting for representatives of selected sites so we can walk them through their next steps. And so just very briefly to cover what those next steps are and what happens during the year that you're listed. The Trust works with you in all of the ways that Dennis listed earlier when he talked about the role of the Georgia Trust. And we look at the Places in Peril list like our to-do list for the year. So you get very concentrated attention and any assistance that the Trust can provide. I think Dennis said you get a staff liaison, so you have very direct one-on-one communication. We do site visits with you in the community so that we can see the site firsthand and get involved and provide any assistance that we might need to on that local level. And we also continue to provide technical assistance, however it's best suited to your particular site. And so that wraps up the nomination process. And now, unless any of my co-presenters have anything else to add, I think we can go ahead and move on to taking questions. Dennis mentioned earlier, there is a tab to submit questions. And if you've already submitted a question, Dennis will be going through them and he's going to start asking some of those. But if not, go ahead and if you have questions, go to the question tab now and send those over our way and we will try to address as many as we can. If we do have many similar questions, we will try to just kind of compile those into one. So Dennis, do you have any questions for us?
Yes, I do actually. One question. First question is there funding that comes with being listed as a place in peril?
I'll handle that one. That's probably the most common question that we get. There is not any direct funding available for sites that are selected as places in peril. There's a tremendous, I hope you see, there's a tremendous amount of value that you get through our efforts and attention. Excuse me. But unfortunately, we cannot spread our resources across all of the places in peril year to year. Otherwise, we would be spread pretty thin. And as Mark mentioned, we really do rely on our local partners. So they are able to frequently use the platform or an amplification of places in peril listing for further fundraising, whether it's grants or community fundraising. And there is a small grant program that the Georgia Trust operates, the Callahan Incentive Grant, that's typically available for projects that are close to completion but need a little bit of a push over the edge. That's not specifically for place in peril programs or sites, but sites that are past places in peril certainly have a leg up in that funding source as well. So to answer the question, no, there is no direct funding involved with listing, but it has, there's a lot of examples of successful fundraising thanks in part to a places in peril listing.
And I'll just add, Ben, we do offer a fundraising 101 seminar each year that is highly encouraged for our places in peril representatives.
That's right.
That's great. Thank you, guys. We just got a couple more questions, or a few more questions in my inbox here. Here's one from Jennifer who asks, I heard you say that a place can be on the list more than once. What would the criteria be for a secondary listing? And would it have to be a significant change in the status of the building?
That's an excellent question. And I would say that typically, yes, I think our committee would, if there has been little to no progress after an initial listing in Places in Peril, there would need to be some change in status, whether the threat has changed or become more imminent, or perhaps another opportunity or a change in ownership where the threat exists, but there might be an opportunity for a better outcome. One example that I can give is Fountain Hall that was just listed in 2020. It was previously listed as a part of the full Morris Brown campus, I believe in 2010. So it was recognized as an overall threat 10 years ago. There had been not a tremendous amount of change. However, a community group arose to advocate specifically for Fountain Hall. And even though the threat had not changed directly, it was more imminent because of 10 more years of neglect. And the committee felt that it was important to highlight that a site like that, particularly since there seemed to be a greater opportunity for success.
Great, thanks, Ben. Speaking of Fountain Hall, we have a question from Laura who asks that as an advocate for Fountain Hall, my question is, how can I help raise awareness and secure funding?
Another great question. I am assuming you are familiar with the organization, our partner organization, the Friends of Fountain Hall. They are driving the fundraising efforts currently. I'm happy to report that they have received 2 very significant grants from the National Park Service to the tune of $1 million. So the most imminent threat, which was the need for a new roof on that building, is currently being addressed, is in the planning stages. But if you are not familiar with Friends of Fountain Hall, I would certainly reach out to them on Facebook. One of our board members is actually the co-founder of that organization, so we'd be happy to be a conduit for that connection as well. They are working strongly to go at fundraising in both directions, both large grants as well as building grassroots efforts for small fundraising and opportunities for donors. So feel free to email us and we can connect you.
Excellent, thanks, Ben. And we have another good question from Gail. She has 2 questions actually, and her first question is there an age criteria for the property?
So that would be most directly answered by the eligibility question. So a general rule of thumb for the National Register eligibility is that a property be 50 years or older. That's, as I said, a rule of thumb. It's not hard and fast. A property that is less than 50 years would need to have a tremendous amount of significance for us to consider it eligible. So it's not to say that there aren't properties that would fit that criteria, but a safe rule of thumb is 50 years or older.
Great. And Gail's follow-up question is really good because we see this a lot with historic properties, and she's asking if the property was built in 1843 and then renovated, say, in the 1970s, mid-1970s, would that disqualify a property?
Not necessarily. It would depend on how renovated it was in the 1970s, to be quite honest. If we were to be able to investigate through the photographs and the narrative questions, if we were able to discern that a significant portion of the original property was still there and maybe just hidden by some of the changes, that would not disqualify the property. If the changes had been so significant that the original building really could not be brought back to life without a recreation or a false sense of history, I think that would be a detriment to its listing, both in the National Register and for our listing as places in peril.
Gotcha. Few more points from Gail. She mentions that it was bricked and an extension was added, and it's a church.
So, I would encourage you to consider a nomination. I can't, it would be difficult for me to determine without seeing it whether or not it would meet our criteria. But I would certainly encourage you to explore a nomination. Feel free to reach out to us with specific questions as you look over the nominating materials, and we're happy to help you through that process as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. Okay, we've got a. I'm sorry, go ahead, Mark. Go ahead.
I think the criteria really would be, would the property, Gail, still be eligible for the National Register if it were nominated? And that's a difficult question to answer, but as Ben pointed out, I think he could probably give you a preliminary indication.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark. We've got a good question from Michelle, and this one is more towards the application process. Do we need to provide citations or bibliography for the historical section with our application? And she follows up with, can supplemental resources such as maps be submitted in support of the application?
Danielle, would you like to handle that one?
Sure. So yes, certainly maps or any other graphics or things that are separate from photographs are welcome. The more information, the better. In terms of a bibliography and citations, it is not a requirement that you include those with your narrative. However, if you do have that information, it is certainly helpful, but it's not a requirement to submit a nomination and to fill out the form. And actually,
Great.
I have a question that just came in by email very quickly. Holly has asked whether multiple buildings can be eligible for a nomination or if it has to be a single property. I know that we have had sites listed that are more than one building. Ben, you mentioned earlier the Atlanta University campus, I believe, was previously a site.
Yeah, absolutely. It does not have to be a single property. In the past, we have listed whole historic districts. We've actually listed entire towns, including Sparta and Hartwell, Georgia. I think the trend has been away from sort of those very overbroad nominations, but certainly if there is a historic district, residential or commercial, that is facing threats, we would absolutely consider that nomination. And then we've gotten creative with certain nominations as well in the past, particularly in Atlanta, where all of the historic neighborhoods have been undergoing development pressure over the last 10 years or so. The committee felt strongly, gosh, about 5 years ago or so, that one of the places in peril was simply Atlanta's historic neighborhoods and the teardowns that were taking place there. So certainly don't feel like you have to limit it to one particular property. We are willing and able to get creative with the definition of the resource and the definition of the threat. I will say it's easier to quantify success when it's focused on one particular resource or one particular district.
Thank you, Ben. We have another question here. If a site is privately owned, Do I need the owner's permission to nominate it?
No.
Excellent.
As we touched on, I think it is reasonable to try to discuss with an owner, but perhaps you don't know who the owner is or they're unreachable. If there's community support for sort of highlighting a local landmark and the owner does not want to participate or cannot be reached, we certainly will not hold that against the nomination.
Very good. Thanks, Ben. Another good question we've got here is, how can I find out if my site is listed on the National Register of Historic Places?
That's a great question. I will tell you the easiest and generally a reliable way to do it is to go to Google, type in your county and National Register of Historic Places, and frequently the first search answer will be Wikipedia, and I have found that to be generally reliable for finding National Register districts and individual listings within counties in Georgia. If you don't find that to be reliable or want more information, we would be happy to help you seek that out. And you can also reach out to the Historic Preservation Division at the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, who is the state organization or administration that monitors and administers that program at the state level. But again, it does not have to be already listed. It just needs to be eligible. And frequently, one of the goals that people want to get out of a listing is having a site named to the National Register. So that is another opportunity for us to aid with the progress of preserving a site around the state.
Dennis, I think we have time for one more question.
All right, and our final question is, and it's another good one, is if a site has been nominated before, but it wasn't selected, can it be nominated again?
Absolutely, for sure. As Mark mentioned, and as hopefully you can take away from this, we certainly feel that the most successful preservation stories through this program have been where there is established community support. If you're not at that point, spend the year building that support, whether it's a Facebook group, save the so-and-so house, whether it's working with local authorities to try to create a preservation plan. But if you nominate a site and it is not selected, certainly, as Danielle touched on, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not worthy. It may not fit based on the other nominations that we received in a given year. We may not feel that the threat is imminent enough, but certainly after 2 or 3 years of continued neglect, there can be a better example of that threat. So absolutely, do not take being rejected or not listed in 1 year as a reason to not nominate again. And we'd be happy if a site is not nominated. We would be happy to explain in the process why, if there is a particular reason it was not
Selected. Yeah. Okay, so if there are other questions, you can certainly reach out to us. Our email is here on this slide, preservation@georgiatrust.org. But I just want to we all want to thank you guys for joining us. Dennis mentioned this is our first webinar, so we're very excited to be able to be bringing new web content to you guys in this format. After the webinar has ended, there will be a survey that comes up, and we would be very grateful if you would just take a few minutes to go ahead and fill out that survey, just to let us know how we did and how we can continue to improve the content that we bring to you. Dennis mentioned at the beginning, there's also a handout, which is a PDF copy of all of the slides from this webinar, and that is actually only accessible to download while the webinar is live. So if you wanted to download a copy of the slides, I would go ahead and do that now. There should be a handout tab next to your questions tab. And then finally, we will be sending out an email following the webinar this evening, and that will include a recording of the full webinar. So you can certainly share that with others or have it as a source of reference for you. But if you did find that this webinar was helpful, we encourage you to consider supporting the Georgia Trust by becoming a member so that you can continue to stay updated on all of the information about preservation around our state and continue to get access to our events and educational programs. And so unless there's anything else to add from my fellow presenters, I will give you another minute for anybody trying to download the handouts, and then we will go ahead and sign off.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, looks like we still have just a few folks on there.